All right. Ready to dive into some LAPD procedures?
Sounds like a plan.
We're tackling the LAPD Juvenile Manual today, all 65 pages of it.
Uh-oh. Sounds dense.
It is, but trust me, this stuff is important and fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes it so fascinating?
Well, we're going behind the scenes to see how the LAPD handles situations with minors. Everything from abuse investigations to traffic stops to even political asylum requests.
Wow, that's a wide range. So like a crash course in juvenile justice, LAPD style?
Exactly. We'll decode the legalese, break down the procedures, and highlight some things you might not expect.
Sounds good to me. Let's get started.
Okay, first things first. What's the point of this manual and who's it for?
It's essentially the LAPD's playbook for dealing with anyone under 18.
Makes sense. Gotta have clear guidelines, especially when you're dealing with kids.
Absolutely, and that's actually a big theme throughout the manual, clarity.
Oh yeah, I noticed that. Like that whole section on grammatical construction seems a bit much for a police manual, doesn't it?
Well, they're really hammering home the need for precision in language.
To avoid any misunderstandings.
Exactly. Especially when it comes to legal matters involving minors.
Right.
A misinterpretation could have serious consequences.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how they use minor, child, and juvenile almost interchangeably.
Right, like they're covering all their bases.
Yeah, making sure everyone under 18 is included.
They even break down juvenile offenses into three main categories: dependency, pre-delinquent, and delinquent.
Okay, let's unpack those. What falls under dependency?
Those are cases where a child's safety is at risk, usually due to abuse and neglect by a parent or guardian.
So the focus is on protecting the child.
Exactly. Then you have pre-delinquent offenses,
Which are?
things like truancy, curfew violations, being beyond parental control, stuff that's not quite a criminal offense, but
It could be a sign of trouble down the road.
right. It's about early intervention. And finally, you have delinquent offenses.
Those are the serious ones.
Yeah, the same crimes that would be charged against an adult.
Okay, so they've got a system for categorizing everything. Now, one thing that really stood out to me was the section on child abuse investigations. It's pretty intense.
They don't sugarcoat it. The LAPD takes child abuse very seriously.
And they make it clear that certain professionals are required to report any suspected abuse.
Right. Teachers, doctors, social workers, it's the law.
So what happens when a report is made? What are the next steps?
Well, the person reporting has to call the authorities immediately.
And then?
They have to file a written report within 36 hours.
So it kicks off a whole investigation.
Exactly. And the officer responding to the scene has a very specific protocol to follow.
Like what?
First, they interview the child, separately from the parents, to make sure the child feels safe to speak freely.
Makes sense. What else?
They examine the child for any signs of injury. Contact DCFS.
That's the Department of Children and Family Services, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
they might even take the child into protective custody, depending on the situation.
So it's all about gathering information and making sure the child is safe.
Right. And they even have specialized units like Stewart House to help minimize the trauma for these kids.
I've heard of Stewart House. They provide a safe and supportive environment for interviews and exams, right?
Exactly. They really go above and beyond to make these kids feel comfortable.
That's so important. It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding the emotional needs of these children.
Absolutely. Now, beyond the typical abuse and neglect cases, they also have procedures for a whole range of other situations, things you might not think of right away.
Okay, I'm curious. What kind of situations?
Well, they have a section called Special Circumstances. It covers things like drug-addicted babies, kids abandoned at hospitals, really tough stuff.
That must be heartbreaking for the officers involved.
It is. They often work closely with DCFS to find a safe placement for the child, which can be a long process.
And what about juveniles with mental illnesses? How are those situations handled?
That's another area where they have to be very careful. The manual emphasizes assessment and appropriate care.
So they don't just jump to detention.
No, they try to de-escalate the situation and get the juvenile the help they need.
But is detention ever allowed in those cases?
Yes, but only if a mental health professional deems it necessary for the safety of the juvenile or others.
So there are safeguards in place.
Right. And if detention is necessary, there are clear procedures for how to handle it.
What happens if a parent or guardian isn't available or refuses to take custody of the juvenile?
Then things get a bit more complex. They might end up booking the juvenile under the emotionally disturbed category of the dependency code. That's 300C WIC.
Which basically means DCFS takes custody.
Exactly. They'll place the juvenile in a safe environment.
So even in these tough situations, they have procedures to protect these vulnerable kids.
Exactly. The manual also has guidelines for how officers should interact with juveniles experiencing a mental health crisis.
Like what?
Well, for instance, they're not supposed to handcuff a mentally ill juvenile unless it's absolutely necessary for safety.
It's about minimizing trauma and treating them with respect.
Right. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about arrests. What happens when a juvenile is taken into custody?
Okay, good question. What are the rules regarding detention in a police facility?
They have something called the 6-hour rule.
Meaning?
A juvenile can't be held in a police facility for longer than 6 hours.
Okay, so there's a time limit. Are there ever exceptions to that rule?
Yeah, a few. Like if the juvenile needs medical attention or if the investigation requires more time.
So there's some flexibility built in.
Right. They also have specific procedures for handcuffing juveniles.
I bet that's a sensitive issue.
It is. They emphasize that handcuffs should only be used when absolutely necessary for safety.
So it's about using the least restrictive measures possible.
Exactly. And once the 6-hour limit is up, they either have to release the juvenile or transport them to a county juvenile hall.
Makes sense. What about the paperwork? What kind of documentation is needed when a juvenile is detained at juvenile hall?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of forms. Arrest report, juvenile hall, entrance record, medical screening, even a copy of their fingerprints, plus a probable cause declaration.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's all for accountability and transparency. It helps ensure that the probation department has all the info they need to make decisions about the juvenile's case.
So it's not just bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy.
Right. It's about protecting everyone's rights and making sure the process is fair.
And speaking of rights, it's important to remember that juveniles still have rights, even when they're in trouble with the law.
Absolutely. There's a whole section in the manual devoted to the rights of juveniles.
What kind of rights are we talking about?
Well, for instance, they have the right to an attorney.
And the manual outlines how that works.
Yes. If a juvenile requests an attorney, all questioning has to stop until the attorney arrives.
So they're not left to fend for themselves.
Right. And it's not just about having an attorney. It's about making sure they understand their rights and don't accidentally waive them.
Now, what about lineups? How do they handle those when a juvenile might be identified by a witness?
That can be tricky, but they have strict guidelines to ensure fairness. For instance, the lineup has to include at least 5 people who look similar to the accused.
To avoid any bias.
Exactly. And both the prosecuting and defense attorneys have to be notified about the lineup in advance.
So everyone has a chance to make sure it's done properly.
Right. And when it comes to juvenile records, the manual is very clear about confidentiality.
Which is important for protecting their privacy and future prospects.
Absolutely. They don't want these kids to be haunted by mistakes they made as minors.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot here, from the different types of offenses to the procedures for arrests and detentions. What stands out to you as particularly insightful about all this?
I think the level of detail is impressive, and the emphasis on protecting the rights of these young people, even when they've messed up. It's clear they're trying to balance law enforcement with the understanding that kids are still developing and deserve a chance at rehabilitation.
I agree. It's a nuanced approach that recognizes the unique challenges faced by young people.
Now let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about missing and found juveniles.
Yeah, that's a whole other
Chapter 6
ball game.
lays out a very specific set of protocols for these cases.
Right, because kids go missing all the time.
Unfortunately, it's true.
And there has to be a way to...
There are different categories of missing juveniles.
Right.
You have critical missing, runaway, parental abduction, and so on.
So it depends on, like, the circumstances.
Yes. This categorization helps officers prioritize their efforts and tailor their response to the specific circumstances.
Right.
And then you can see that in the way they approach the initial report, the officer taking the report needs to gather as much information as possible.
Like what kind of information?
Detailed descriptions, clothing, any identifying marks, known medical or mental health conditions, anything that might help locate the juvenile.
Makes sense. So they can get...
It often is a race against time. And that's why they immediately enter the information into national databases like the National Crime Information Center or NCIC and the LAPD's own Missing Persons Unit database known as MUPS
NCIC, that's the one that's used by law enforcement.
across the country.
Nationwide.
Nationwide. So by entering this information into these systems, they're essentially casting a wide net, alerting other agencies, increasing the chances of finding the missing juvenile.
So they're not just relying on the LAPD.
Right. It's a nationwide search.
And then this manual also talks about Amber alerts, care alerts, and silver alerts. Can you explain those?
Yeah, these alerts are like a megaphone,
Oh, I've seen them on my phone on the freeway signs.
quickly getting information out to the public when a person's safety is at stake.
I was going to say, it seems like they're really trying to get the word out as quickly as possible.
Right, they can be very
And
effective.
those aren't used for every case, right?
Right. The Amber Alert specifically is reserved for cases where there's a confirmed abduction and the child is believed to be in imminent danger.
So that's like the most.
Serious.
The care alert has broader criteria, encompassing situations where a child is missing under suspicious circumstances or might need medical attention.
Okay, so it's broader.
Broader.
Not quite as serious, but
Still
still
concerning.
concerning.
And then the silver alert,
Is that
that was created specifically for missing seniors or individuals with cognitive impairments like dementia or Alzheimer's,
okay? So they have alerts that are
catered to the situation.
right, specifically for those cases.
Yeah.
And then what about when they find a missing juvenile?
Well, the manual also outlines specific procedures for what happens when a missing juvenile is found.
They can't just drop them off at home.
No, they have to.
Someone has to come get them.
Verify their identity and ensuring their well-being.
Now, speaking of unique situations, this manual covers some really fascinating scenarios that you might not immediately associate with juvenile procedures.
Like what? I'm intrigued.
Well, for instance, it outlines procedures for handling juvenile requests for political asylum.
That's a whole other level of.
Imagine being a minor,
I can't even.
fleeing your home country,
Yeah,
and seeking refuge in the United States.
that must be terrifying.
And the manual lays out a very specific process for how the LAPD handles these requests, ensuring that these vulnerable young people are treated with dignity and respect.
So it's not just about like,
Kids committing crime.
yeah, or kids in trouble. It's about all sorts of situations that kids can find themselves in.
It's a reminder that the juvenile justice system isn't just about dealing with crime, it's about protecting the rights and well-being of all minors, regardless of their circumstances.
That's a good point. What about undocumented juveniles? How do those investigations work?
That's another sensitive area. But the manual provides specific guidelines, including procedures for fingerprinting undocumented juveniles.
Fingerprinting undocumented juveniles. That's
All about balancing the need to uphold the law with the recognition that these young people are in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, you have to be sensitive to the situation.
Now, the manual also delves into case law, using real-life examples to illustrate how the courts have interpreted juvenile rights in specific situations.
Okay, so they're showing how these rules have played out.
Exactly. And it gives officers concrete examples to guide their actions.
So what are some of the cases they highlight?
Well, there's People v. Redding, which dealt with the search of a student's belongings at school.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that one.
It sparked a lot of debate about students' privacy rights.
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
And the court ultimately ruled that the search in that case was unconstitutional because it violated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
So that set a precedent.
A precedent for protecting students from arbitrary searches at school.
So that's something that, like, as a parent or a teacher,
You should be aware of.
you should know.
Then there's People v. Nelson, which addressed the issue of a juvenile's request to speak with a parent during questioning.
Okay.
And the court in that case determined that such a request doesn't automatically mean the juvenile is invoking their right to remain silent or to have an attorney present.
Right, because you might just want to talk to your mom or your dad.
But you still need to be informed of your rights.
Exactly.
And these cases, along with others mentioned in the manual, provide valuable legal context for officers navigating the complexities of juvenile law.
So it's not just about like what's written in the manual, it's about how it's been interpreted by the courts.
Right, because the law is constantly evolving and being reinterpreted.
Okay, so now we've talked about all sorts of situations where a juvenile might be in trouble with the law. But this manual also talks about more everyday interactions, like traffic stops. So what are the rules there?
The manual stresses the importance of treating juveniles with respect and understanding during traffic stops.
I mean, that should be the case anyway, right?
Right, but especially when it's a young person.
Yeah, because it can be intimidating, even for an adult.
Exactly. And the manual encourages officers to explain the reason for the stop clearly, avoiding any jargon or legal terms that might confuse the juvenile.
So it's like, just talk to them.
In plain English.
Right, like a person.
And they also provide guidance for handling situations where a juvenile might be driving without a license or with a suspended license,
Oh,
which can get complicated.
I bet.
But the manual outlines a process for handling those situations and ensuring the juvenile's rights are protected and that their parents are notified.
Okay, so even in those like seemingly routine
They
interactions,
still have a
specific procedures in place.
to ensure that the juvenile is treated fairly.
Okay, and now let's talk about a topic that I'm sure is really difficult for everyone involved in investigations of child-on-child sex crimes.
Yes, this is a very sensitive area.
Requires a lot of expertise
A lot of sensitivity,
and training,
specialized training,
and the manual recognizes that.
because sometimes the young person involved might themselves be a victim of abuse.
Right, so you have to be really careful,
It emphasizes the need for a trauma-informed approach,
which means
ensuring that both the victim and the alleged offender receive appropriate support and legal representation.
so it's not just about like who did what to whom
It's about understanding the whole situation
and the underlying dynamic.
and providing support to all parties involved.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that these are young people who are often struggling with a lot of complex issues, and the goal is to help them heal and move forward in a positive direction.
So it's not just about punishment.
Right. It's
Right.
about rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Now, shifting back to a slightly less emotionally charged topic,
Okay.
the manual also covers something called hospital overstays.
Hospital overstays. What's that?
That refers to situations where a child remains in the hospital for an extended period, even though they're medically cleared for discharge.
Why would that happen?
There are a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because the family is facing difficult circumstances.
Okay.
Maybe they're experiencing homelessness, or they're dealing with domestic violence, or they simply don't have the resources to care for the child at home.
So it's not always a medical reason?
Right, there might be social or economic factors at play.
Okay, so what does the LAPD do?
The manual provides guidance for officers who encounter these situations, encouraging them to connect the family with appropriate social services and resources.
So they're not just like, get out of the hospital. They're actually trying to help
Right, they're trying to address the underlying issues.
to make sure the kid has a safe place to go.
Exactly.
So we've seen how this manual like covers everything from serious crimes to like everyday stuff,
It really shows how complicated it is for law enforcement to work with kids.
especially while trying to keep their best interests in mind.
And it shows that the LAPD knows how important specialized training is for officers handling juvenile cases.
Makes sense. The law's always changing, and what works best is always being like updated.
Exactly. It's not just about laws changing, though. It's also about knowing how kids develop, how trauma affects them, and how to help them get back on track.
Yeah, it's not just about punishing them.
Exactly. More and more, we see that even kids who commit serious crimes can change.
It's about giving them a chance to learn from mistakes and become good members of society.
And that's why the manual talks about how important it is to work with people in the community.
Like social workers, therapists, teachers.
Right, to give these kids the support they need to succeed.
So it's not all on the LAPD.
It takes a village, right?
Exactly. So as we finish up our look at the LAPD Juvenile Manual, what are the like big takeaways? What should people remember?
I think the main thing is just how complicated it is to work with kids in the legal system. This manual shows just how many rules and things you have to think about to protect them.
It's like a roadmap for a really tough journey.
Exactly. And it's important to see how committed the LAPD is to being fair to these kids. The whole manual stresses protecting their rights, giving them lawyers, and treating them with respect.
Yeah, remembering that even though they messed up, they're still kids who deserve another chance.
Right. And lastly, I think it's good to remember that this whole juvenile justice system is constantly changing.
So this manual's just a snapshot of where things are now.
And it'll change as we learn more about kids and how to work with them best,
So it's a process that never really ends.
which is what makes it so interesting.
Well, I think we did a good job of explaining how the LAPD deals with situations involving minors. It's complicated, but it's meant to protect kids who are some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And we always encourage our listeners to keep learning about this stuff and think about how we can make things fairer for all kids, no matter what their situation is.
That's a great point. So one last thought for everyone listening. We saw how the LAPD made this detailed manual to guide them, but what about the rest of us? What can we do as individuals, as a community, to create a system that's more just and fair for young people? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.